It's where John Milton is buried. He died in a house in Artillery Row in 1674, and it was while he was there that he published Paradise Lost. He's actually buried next to his father, and his first wife, Mary, is also buried in the church, but not with them. Now, this is his statue here. Its original home was outside that north door, where it's put in 1903. But we've got him here for safety's sake. But the plinth on which he's standing, that's outside our west door, contains a quotation from Paradise Lost, and feel that it won't come to any harm up there. Now, the church in which you're in is the 1394 foundation, built during the reign of Richard II. But it's a church which has suffered from various fires during its lifetime, and therefore it's heavily restored. The first fire was in 1545 in the reign of Henry VIII, and the restoration plans of that year were found in Lambeth Palace. And Godfrey Allen did the restoration of the church after the Second World War, used those plans so as to make the church as much like the original as he could. Now, it's interesting that the Great Fire of London, 1666, destroyed over 80 city churches, but left this one alone. And there were two reasons for this. First, because of the position outside the town ditch, and secondly, they gunpowdered all the houses at the Moorgate end of 4th Street, which was the street running along the north face of the church, to create a windbreak, in fact. But we do know that the flames came near the church and cracked the glass in the windows, because according to our registers, most of them had to be replaced. There was another fire, the Cripplegate fire, in 1898, which partially damaged the church. And then, of course, the church was very badly bombed during the Second World War. There was a direct hit on that north door in the summer of 1940, and then December 1940, the church was showered with incendiary bombs, so that even the cement caught alight, and all that was left of the church was simply the shell. The arcade here in the chancel, the outside walls, and the tower, everything went up in flames. I'll show you some pictures of it. The furniture which you see in this church comes from St Luke's Church in Old Street, no longer a church, of course, and that's what it looks like. Now, that church of St Luke's was built in 1733. Two reasons for this. First, they thought that the parish of St Giles was too large and therefore ought to be split. So the north part became St Luke's parish, the south part St Giles parish. Now, the two architects were John James and Nicholas Hawksmoor, both the pupils of Wren. Now, that church was built on marshy ground, and apparently, if you built on marshy ground, before we started to build with bricks and stones, you put down layers of wood mingled with cement. By 1900, the wood had started to rot, and you got the beginning of subsidence in the church, which was ignored. So that by 1959, the church had to be closed as a dangerous structure. Now, they wanted £126,000 through the restoration of the church, but the diocese refused to pay. It said the Church of St Luke's was of not sufficient interest, either architecturally or historically. They were wrong on both counts. And so, eventually, in 1964, the church was gutted. Most of the furniture came here. The pews, the choir stalls, this altar, and most important of all is the organ. When it was in St Luke's Church, it was said that when Handel, when he was in London, played on it, that Anne, our director of music, says Handel refused to play on every organ in London. That organ loft, of course, is new, and some of the piping and the panelling is new, but the central part of it is part of the original Jordan and Griffin. They were the organ makers at the time. Right, now, can I take you up? Oh, now we're going to get here better. I'd like to take you up to the to the altar here. Now, I wonder how, oh no.
I don't think it's going to work. I don't think we should risk it actually.
No,
don't worry,
can you bring it round there? Yeah. Now, this is part here of the original 14th century church. It's a sedilia where the priest sat, and the basila where they disposed of the excess communion wine. Those tiles are Roman tiles because we're very much in the Roman part of the city. The floor was raised during the Victorian period. A lot of work was done during that Victorian period. The outside was surfaced with Kentish ragstone to strengthen the walls, and a lot of stained glass was put in. This window here, of course, is post-war. In the pre-war church, you had an oval window like that, and this is because there was a block of flats outside, and to the left there was a pub. These were bombed, and after the bombing, they saw the tracing of the perpendicular window, so they restored it in this way. Some of the figures are religious figures, others are historical figures connected with the history of the church. The figure in red there is Lancelot Andrews, our most famous rector so far, says Catherine. He was rector here for 17 years, from 1588 to 1605, and died as the Bishop of Winchester. He's also famous because he helped to translate the part of the Old Testament of the 1604 Bible. The person next to him is St Anselm, and he was the Archbishop of Canterbury when the first Holy Church was built on this spot in 1090 in the reign of William Rufus. The person next to him, St Alfred, also an Archbishop of Canterbury, a bit earlier in the 11th century, and he's in the window because the church of St Alfred, which you see as a room of the podium as you go towards Moorgate, is now part of our parish. He was beaten to death with the bones of oxen by the Dane village. And when his body was being taken to Canterbury for burial, it was supposed to be shipped over the Thames in a boat which was steered by King Cripplegate, our Danish king. That's according to tradition. That's our patronal saint up there, St Giles. It's said that he was born a very wealthy parent in Athens in the 8th century, and when he inherited his wealth, he gave it all up and went to live as a hermit in the cave in the Rhone of France. That animal which you see at the front of him is a doe, and that was his source of food. Can you see the arrow in his right hand? Grace? Yes. The story goes that the King of France, Charles Martel, was out hunting near the cave, saw the doe, went to shoot at it, Sir Giles rushed out to protect it. As a result of this incident, numerous conversations took place between the two men, and it said that the King of France was so impressed with Sir Giles that he decided on the spot of the cave to build a monastery of Nîmes, and he made Sir Giles the first abbot. Now, this church is known as St Giles Cripplegate, and visitors have said, I know why it's called Cripplegate, because of the cripples outside the town gate. Now, that doesn't have to be so at all. The town gate was 100 yards the other side of that east window. It was demolished in 1760. No doubt there would be lame people and beggars and cripples outside that gate wanting alms from travellers as they came in and out of London. But the word Cripplegate comes from an Anglo-Saxon word Cripplegate, and it means a covered rail tunnel. And it was a covered rail tunnel from the town gate to the Barbican, which was the fortress of the city. Right now, I'll show you our worldly wealth here. Now, this used to be in bank. It used to be in bank vaults because we had this alarm cabinet, so we were able to show off our silverware. Now, this is the arms plate of St Luke's Church. We share the communion plate of St Luke's Church with Wesley's Chapel, and it's because we have a rapprochement with them. Catherine goes and preaches there, and the minister comes and preaches here. And we share the communion plate because John and Charles Wesley were curates there. But of course, the communion plate is further in this cabinet, and it's too precious for us to use. These silverware here is part of the communion plate of two churches in Cripplegate, St Peter's and St Mildred's, that were bombed and not restored. This silverware here is on loan to us from the Cripplegate Foundation. Those cups and beakers date from the reign of James I. This is the badge of the person. There was a workhouse built at the end of the 17th century, now and demolished at the end of the 19th century. And this was the beadle's badge. Sometimes it's worn by the caretaker. The beadle also had this stave here. Oh, you can't see it. It's this one here, but it belonged to him in order to keep order in the workhouse there. This is a snuff box here, dates from the reign of George III, and it's used by the workhouse committee during its deliberations. That is a pepper pot, and it was used by again by the committee during its deliberations, and it dates from the reign of George IV. Now, this flagon here is interesting. It was given to the church by John Pritchett, who was director here in about 1664. And it shows the number of people that must have been taking communion this time. It was reckoned from the early part of the 17th century, there were 400 people in the congregation. That's when people lived and worked on the same spot. As a result of this, balconies were put up round three sides of the church. With the building of the railways from 1830, people moved out to the suburbs, so that by 1900, it was reckoned, there were only 1,000 people living in the parish, and they were largely caretakers and their families. Now, it's interesting that St Luke's Church also has a balcony, but that was not removed, although depopulation took place there as well. The reason being that here the balcony was not part of the original medieval church, but with the St Luke's Church, the balconies were part of the original 18th century church, so that was retained. Right, now I'll take you, I've got to think I've mentioned what I wanted.
Can I ask a question? You mentioned the Cripplegate Foundation.
Pardon?
You mentioned the Cripplegate Foundation.
Yes, it's on loan to us.
Well, what is the Cripplegate Foundation?
It's a charity. It's one of the important charities that we have. Now, this is where the state sword is put, where important people ever visited the church, particularly the Prime Minister and the Queen. Now, I've been a member of the church for 44 years and seen neither, but it does brighten up that bit of corner there, and it shows the 6 aldermen of Cripplegate who became Lord Mayors of London, and the last one was Alan Davis, who died several years ago. Now, does the name John Fox mean anything to you? He wrote got to be elderly like me to know this. He wrote a very famous book, Fox's Book of Martyrs. It's the account of the life and the death of the Protestant priests that were put to death by the orders of Queen Mary Tudor. He was the lecturer here, and it's an office that the church doesn't have now, I don't think. And I used to tell people, well, it could be equivalent to being a curate, but I was told off by a scholar of the 17th century, and he said, oh no, he was not equivalent to a curate, he was probably more important than the actual vicar, because he had to give the sermons, and in those days there could be 2 or 3 hours in length, and therefore he had to be a very learned man indeed. He's buried here. There was a memorial to him, but that was destroyed in the war. People get him mixed up with George Fox, who's a founder of Quakerism, or James Fox, the 18th century politician, but they don't seem to have heard about Fox here. Right, now, once you come over here, this lectern is a memorial to Bishop Andrews. It was in our Muniment room, which was separated from the main body of the church only by steps and escaped all these incendiary bombs. So not only was this saved, but two portraits of previous rectors, one of which is under the tower. And most important of all is our registers. And these date from 1561 and now in the Guildhall Library, where they're consulted by various scholars. There is a tradition that William Shakespeare was the chief witness to the baptism of his 2 nephews, which took place in this church. The father boy was Edmund, living in the parish. He was an actor like his brother and is buried in the cathedral. Sorry, I've forgotten. The story goes that William Shakespeare had to escape from Stratford-on-Avon because he was going to be prosecuted for deer-stealing from Chalcot Park, which was owned by Sir Thomas Lucy. Now, Sir Thomas Lucy, he pokes fun of as Justice Sheridan through his plays. King Henry IV, Part 1, and the Merry Wives of Windsor. Now, it's ironically escaped here to Cripplegate because he would have bumped into the Lucy family had he attended this church on a Sunday. Because this was their parish church when they were living in Aldersgate, where their town house was. Now, let's go from there. Yes, Sir Thomas Lucy, in actual fact, is buried in the church. We don't know where, but we do know where his great-granddaughter Margaret is buried, and she's buried down there. And this square plaque was put up by her grandmother, and she died in the same year as her great-grandfather, 1634. Now, I'll take down here. Part of the body of Martin Frobisher is buried here. Martin Frobisher was one of the captains against the Spanish Armada. He was also a searcher of the northwest passage to the Bice Islands, which of course he didn't find. He was wounded in a naval engagement with the Spanish off the French coast in 1594. He was taken to Plymouth, where he in St Martin's Church, and before burial, he was his heart and entrails were taken out as part of the well, I don't know what you call it, yes, something
part of the embalming process.
Embalming process, yes, as part of the embalming process. The rest of the body was brought here, and because he had a house in Beach Street, and his wife, unfortunately, died in the poorhouse. I don't quite know the circumstances of that, but what's left of Martin Frobisher lies there. This is John Speed. He's a famous map maker and historian of the reigns of Elizabeth I and James I. He's buried down there. That much an adventurer. We have a lot of Speeds come and visit us in the church and take numerous photographs of their ancestors up there. And William and James were the last two I saw, and I said to William, I said, well, you look like her ancestor. I said, you've got the same shaped head. And apparently it was the great-grandson of John Speed that went to America and founded the American branch of the family, and the family home was an architectural gem, in actual fact, in Louisville, in Kentucky. But though it's now a museum.
Right. Is that the original site? It's original. That memorial?
And the memorial isn't. That's new. The head there and bust, that's original. Okay. That's original. But the plinth, I call it the plinth, which is the cash for that was provided by the Merchant Taylors Company. In order to put anything in the church, you've got to have an authorisation of the chancellor and all goodness only knows what. And you've got to have the money for it too. Right, now this statue of Milton is larger than life. It wasn't quite as tall as this, and you can see it's in the Puritan codes of the period. There's the buttons and there's the from which the artist found. The artist Henry Montfort, and actually English Heritage are liking us to put him back outside the door, but I don't think we will. Too dangerous.
How old was the statue? Does that date?
At 1903. Yes, that's where it was put outside the north door. Mm-hmm. Right. Now, as you look down here. These pictures are interesting because they show the effect of the bombing. There's St Giles Church. That's what it looked after the war. That cupola that you see there, that was removed. Now, you wouldn't believe this. This is 4th Street, that street outside the north door there, before the war. This is what it looked like after the bombing. There's our church there, and that's because it's completely transformed. The church was in one of the worst hit areas of London. You can see from this picture here all the devastation around it. And there's another picture of the church. That, I think, is the rectory, the old rectory there. This happened in the summer of 1940. Poor old Milton is lying on his back there, but he wasn't damaged, well, just slightly damaged, but easy to repair. That's our original font in the bombed church, but it was bombed beyond reparation. Couldn't do anything with it. This is one of the first services held in the church. That's even before it even had a roof on. Now, here you can see, again, the devastation around the church. There's the church there, and the devastation there. Now, this is interesting. This is the fireman's house. After the bombing, the firemen got earth from Hampstead Heath and created allotments here. And they grew chickens, well, they grew cabbages and potatoes and kept rabbits and chickens. Very adventuresome, very resourceful. Right. Now, if you come along here.
Look, that's Roman house. So Granny's house is about there. Mm-hmm.
These busts are also unknown to us from the Cripplegate Foundation. Had that been in the church, that would have been destroyed. This is Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe. He was, in actual fact, married in the church. He lived in a house in Fore Street and died in Ropemaker Street, according to our registers, in 1731. This bust is of Milton, and this one is of Oliver Cromwell. He was married in this church in 1620 to Elizabeth Boucher, the daughter of a Cripplegate merchant, and he was 21. And this is John Bunyan. He was christened in the church, was a fairly regular church goer, and after his release from Bedford jail, he established a little church in June Street where he used to take services. Both John Bunyan and Daniel Defoe, they're buried in Bunhill Fields, which is a nonconformist cemetery here, about a mile away. And in that cemetery lies two of the children of Oliver Cromwell, Henry, who became Lord Protector, Richard and Henry. Richard became Lord Protector for a short time, proved too incompetent to last. Right, now, are you all right? Right, now come in here. This is the best way to see this. You get the rather peculiar light. I think it's best if you could see it from up here. Can you, no, you check from there. I don't know whether this... From here. Yes, not too bad. Now, here's Dr. William Nichols. He was the first rector of St Luke's and the vicar of St Giles. They believed in plurality those days. We've also got the picture of his successor, but we're waiting for some cash to have the portrait framed. Now, in this west window, that's the coat of arms, the coat of arms of the City of London. The blue coat of arms is the coat of arms of the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the one across the is the coat of arms of the Bishop of London. In the lower frame, with that old colonnade, that's the coat of arms of the Earls of Bridgewater, who used to live in what is known as Bridgewater Square now, and there are 10 Earls of Bridgewater and 3 Earls of Kent who are buried in this church. It's when the wealthy castles were building their town houses in the parish. It was the Earl of Bridgewater who was the patron of Milton, and when he wrote his verse play Comus, it was actually performed by the Bridgewater family in Ludlow Castle, which was a part of their Shropshire estate. And when that statue of Milton Somerset held of arms during the reign of Henry VIII, and he's buried in our church. The double-headed eagle is a shield of Milton, the standing lion is a shield of Oliver Cromwell, and the one with the dogs is a shield of Martin Frobisher. They've all been incorporated in the window. Now, if you look at this here, the last rector of St Luke's was Edward Rogers, 1959, and he hadn't been long in his rectory rule. There was a knock on the door, and there was a member from the diocese saying, "We're closing on the church." He did try and get a fund going, but it was in the poor part of the parish, and people weren't interested, so the money had to be returned. Then in 1966, the parishes of St Giles and St Luke were recombined, and Edward became the rector of the combined parishes. The following David Road, and then we got a lovely lady rector, Catherine. The vicars of St Giles go all the way back to Aylward. Now, we know very little about these people because most of the documents relating to them were destroyed in the fire of 1545 and others destroyed during the Great Fire of London. But we do know something about Thomas Salter here. His father, John Slaughter, was a goldsmith, and he left money to the church. Well, it was property that he left to the church, and which was converted into money, and I think it's worth now about £5,000 per annum. Quite considerable, really. Now, the money had certain qualifications attached to it. It couldn't be used for day-to-day running of the church. It had to be used for the improvement of the fabric of the church. So when we have a quinquennial survey and we have to fill a few cracks up, that becomes a godsend. Now, we know more about these people. Their careers reflect the religious and political activities that were going on. Now, Robert Crowley here, 1565, he's removed after 4 years. Who's actually buried in our church. Now, Robert Crowley was a Puritan. He didn't like wearing a white surplice in the church. He didn't like singing in the church. And so he was removed, and I say, replaced by Dr. John, buried in our church. Now, you see, he comes back again, 1578 for 10 years. So he must have made his peace with the establishment, which wasn't very difficult in those days, because the Elizabethan religious settlement was very much a compromised one. As she said, I'm not looking to search into men's souls, so long as they outwardly conformed, she didn't mind what they secretly believed. Thomas Crowley is followed by Lance Andrews, our most famous rector, so far, and he's followed by John Buckridge, 1605. And it was John Buckridge that spoke the funeral oration at Dr. Andrews' funeral. John Buckridge was also the Bishop of Rochester, and for 300 years this was a very prestigious living. And then not only vicars or later rectors, but there were also bishops or even archdeacons. John Buckridge is followed by William Fuller, 1628. Now, it said that when Dr. Fuller was the incumbent here, unseemly contests took place in the church, and it's recorded that on one occasion the parishioners got inside the church and knocked Dr. Fuller and his assistant out. The chief reason being that Dr. Fuller was very pro-royalist, pro-Charles I, whereas the parishioners tend to be pro-Puritan and pro-Parliament. And when the Civil War broke out, Dr. Fuller fled to Charles I at Oxford. And on his deathbed, he expressed a wish to be buried in his old church of Cripplegate. But the parishioners had the right of veto. They refused to have the body, and so he was buried in St Giles in Foster Lane. Now, his daughter, who was married to the Bishop of Chester, had a memorial to her father put in that church, which, as far as I know, is still there. Now, during the Cromwellian period, there was no official candidate here. The Dean of Chichester had been appointed, but because of the unsettled nature of the times, he couldn't take up his appointment, so the service was taken by an odd itinerant priests here and there. Until 1658, when Richard Cromwell appoints Samuel Annesley to the appointment, to the living. Now, his famous Samuel Annesley was his grandfather of John and Charles Wesley. Now, where the parishioners disliked Dr. Fuller because he was so royalist, they equally disliked Samuel Annesley because he was too Presbyterian for them, and so they gained up against him and were very pleased when he went. The point being is that in 1662, all the clergy had to take the oath to the sometimes I forget these. It was an oath of allegiance to the Church of England, and they refused to take it. You had to accept the 39 articles, and some of them refused, didn't like that. It's the oath of the Act of Uniformity, that's the name, 1662. Now, Samuel Annesley refused to take it, so he was removed, and there were a number of Puritan divines in the city churches, very clever men who had to go. It was very unfortunate. Samuel Annesley is followed by John Dolben, 1662. John Dolben was perhaps reached the highest office. He was an interesting man. He fought for Charles I at the Battle of Marston Moor. He was wounded at the Siege of York, and of the rectors of Cripplegate, reached the highest office because he became the Archbishop of York. And when our previous rector arranged a holiday for us at York, we saw his magnificent tomb in York Minster. John Dolben was followed by John Pritchett, who gave us that flagon, and he was also the Bishop of Gloucester. He's followed by Edward Fowler, also the Bishop of Gloucester, 1682, and it was during Edward Fowler's incumbency that two of the famous schools in the area were built. The Lady Eleanor Hollis School, which is still in existence in Hampton on the Thames, and the Cripplegate Boys' School. Now that went defunct at the beginning of the 20th century because the state was entering education, and so it became redundant. John Rogers, 1728, married into the aristocracy. His wife was the sister of Lord Colleray, and for a time he was the chaplain to George I. Also with royal connection, Frederick Blomberg, 1833. His particular friend was the Duke of Cambridge, and it was Dr. Blomberg who was and the Duke of Cambridge was the chief witness to the death of Blomberg, the burial, which took place in his church. William Hale was the Archdeacon of London. Philip Gilbert here, the Victorian vicar, it was during his incumbency when the stained glass was put in, and when a lot of work, the outside brickwork was surfaced with Kentish ragstone to strengthen it. Godfrey Allen, when he did the restoration of the church, he wanted to make the church as light and airy as possible, so he only uses the stained glass for the east end and the west end. At one time, they did think of using St Luke's Church, but the glass, but it was found it was of poor quality, and what was left of it was, as I say, it was of poor quality, and a lot of it had been stolen. So, but he just wanted to make the church light and airy as possible. Everett Turner here, he had a long innings, died as an old man well into his 90s, and here we have Everett Turner there, and yes, there's one of them. Isaacs, oh yes, Frederick Isaacs. He was famous for his embroidery, but most of his work was destroyed during the war. Versatile person. Right, now, right, take her out of here. This font is from St Luke's. We use it now. At one time, we used the 3-ply efforts, but the rectors, the last two rectors, including Catherine, have the congregation come down and watch the baptism. Now, this is one of the it's to celebrate the 100 years anniversary of Cripplegate Foundation. It was founded in 1891. Now, right from early times, people left money to the church, right from the Middle Ages, and they don't do it now. And it was difficult to administer, and so all these various charities were put under the umbrella of the Cripplegate Foundation. It's now celebrated in 1981. It's celebrated its centenary. It's a very wealthy institution now, of course. The bust, the artist, Sheena McKinley. She's a local artist who lived in Bow, and the window was put in by Goddard and Gibbs, which we passed over. the bust up there represents John Saunders, and he's the first of the pious donors that we know by name. Pious donors are people who left money to the church, and each year we used to have a pious donor service and lunch, but because of the crunch and etc., it's been cancelled. The lady represents the ladies who are given pensions by the charity, and the little boy represents the children who help with their education. In the middle ground, you've got Cripplegate, then further on you've got St Giles Church, and further back you've got St Luke's Church. And either side, you've got two emblems. That's the dome, which represents St Giles Church, and the ring ball, that represents St Luke's Church. It is said when an artist is asked to design a central window, she puts two emblems either does stop somebody in 20, 50, 100 years coming along and upsetting her design, putting their own design. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But there we are. Yeah. And the last tool is this window up here. This is the window we put in. It's celebrating life Edward Allen. He was what I call the Knights of Olivia of the late 16th and early 17th century. He was an actor manager, had the Rose Theatre on the south back, and also Ball Pit, incidentally, and had the Fortune Theatre of Whitehall Street. He was a millionaire, and with his cash, he bought a big manor house at Dulwich. And it was the Dulwich estates that used to manage his cash. He left money to this church and at least one other church in the city. But about 10 or so years ago, instead of sending to Luke's Trust, which is the other charity in the a sum of money each year, they gave St Luke's Church a lump sum of £126,000. And to celebrate this, they put this window in. No, sorry, £600,000.
We nearly lost it all when bearings went bust.
Pardon?
We nearly lost it all when bearings went bust.
Oh, really? Oh,
yes.
dear, what a
It was
shame.
on deposit with bearings until just at the point that they went under.
Yeah, oh, dear. Now, that's his coat of arms at the top there. And in his hands, he's got the Allen's almshouses, which were built near St Luke's Church. They were bombed and not restored.
No. That was the Dulwich almshouses.
Pardon?
Those are the Dulwich almshouses.
No.
Oh,
Allen, the almshouses at St Luke's, there you are.
Really?
Now, that's a fortune theatre. It had a very bad reputation. It was in a poor part of the parish and eventually was burnt down at the end of the 17th century. And that, of course, is St Luke's Church. It's no longer a church. For 50 years or so, after it was closed, it was left derelict and really gutted as well. I remember going up there, the old tin door was askew, and inside it was just bare walls, and also had grown trees and bushes. But the Islington Council wanted to buy the site to build homes for the aged, but the cost of exhuming the bodies from the church and the churchyard was £1 million, so they withdrew their offer. Then the fan company wanted to use it as a leisure, as a sort of, well, to build part of their institution. But then they found that the money was, the cost of it was too exorbitant. But with the grant from the lottery, the London Symphony Orchestra have got it. And now it's been really reconverted. But as a but as a musical centre, not as a church. And I remember showing some children round, and I said, well, you've been to St Luke's Church? No. I said, well, I knew they had, because they went for lessons there. But the teacher said, well, they don't know it as a church, they know it as a... So there we are. But it's better to be used as a musical centre than a church where you wouldn't have a congregation. So there we are.
It's
But
beautiful.
it's a lovely
though.
church.
It's beautiful, and that spire, looking at that spire, it always looks so wonderful. And the Fortune Theatre, it says Golden Lane, so
Yes.
it's actually in Golden Lane.
It's just off Golden Lane. There's a plaque there on the left-hand side.
Right.
It was burnt down at the end, as I say, at the end of the 17th century. But he also had the Rose Theatre on the South Bank.
Right.
He was a millionaire at the time he finished.
So, of course, it's Dulwich College, Alleyne
Dulwich
School,
College, Alleyne School.
James
yes.
Allen's Girls' School.
Did a lot with his cash. Yeah.
Did a lot with it, yeah?
Yeah. Right, well, there we are. Oh, done very well.
Thank you very much.
Oh,
That was a wonderful job. Fascinating.
what have you got there?
Been recording you.
Recording it all. Oh, dear.
Recording it all. But Frank,
Yes.
how do you know so much? How have you gathered all this over the years?
Well, over the
Very
years.
good.
Mm?
Very good, very well done.
Oh, thank you very much, dear. That's so, yes.
I'm very impressed at your memory of all of the
Well, I
previous
forget
incumbents.
sometimes, but that's my age, you see. I mean,
But it still gives a sense of the kind of huge variety of individuals.
well, the
that
thing
must
is, I
be
was a
here.
history teacher, so it sort of comes sort of very natural to me. I know the background to it all, or what I remember of it. Did you take notes down,
Yeah, I
Grace?
did a lot of notes.
I've been taking notes, yeah, and then we'll type it up as well, so that we can actually perhaps publish it, put it on the website, make it more
So that other
accessible to
people
people.
can.
Oh, I see. Oh, well, very good. Yes.
But we may need to send it to you for editing first, if
Yeah.
you don't mind.
Okay, yes.
So
Yes.
to
we
make
get
sure
all the
we've
facts right.
Got the facts.
Yes, 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 yes. Oh, well. there
And
we
we'll
are.
have to do some research on those almshouses.
Well, David says, but I read lots of books on the parish, and that's what I read, that they had almshouses in the parish. Yes,
There were almshouses in the parish.
yes, they were bombed near St Luke's Church, and not restored because the City
but
of
the
London
question is
Corporation
whether they
didn't
were
want
deli- whether they
didn't
were
want
Allen's
land
almshouses.
used by the poor people. It was too valuable. That's why it wasn't restored, because it was.
But there weren't Allen's almshouses. Allen's almshouses are at Dulwich.
I know we had them there as well, David. Anyway, never mind. We'll have to check that out.
And David,
I was chairman of the trust when that was put in. I know something about it.
Oh,
David, I'll need from you the full story of the bearings fiasco and how it nearly went.
I guess at the time of Edward Alleyne,
I beg your
at
pardon?
the time of Edward Alleyne, St Luke's Church wouldn't have been there.
Oh,
is that
no, it
right?
wouldn't have
Because
been
came
there.
along in
No,
the
no, they wouldn't have
18th
been.
century.
No. Well, that's what
I
I've
wonder if there had been a church on the spot, though, or whether
Oh,
that
no,
was
not,
just a
not
completely
before.
new...
Not before St.
new
Luke's
build.
Church, no.
Right. So
that
that
was
was
the
part
first
of the...
one built in that area, because it was all arable land. You see, and there was no population.
And it was part of the move to create church capacity
Oh,
with
yes.
the growing populations.
Yes,
like
a growing
Spitalfields
population,
and
yes.
so on and so
Because the
on.
population was gradually moving out into that area. Yes, it was.
That was Queen Anne. Queen Anne had the... Was it not
Pardon?
Queen Anne, or was it Mary? One of the two. Either Queen Mary of William and Mary or
Yeah.
Queen Anne, both were concerned that the populations of the East End were growing so
Oh, it was
considerably.
growing. It definitely was, yes.
churches
Well,
had to be
certainly
built
about the early part of the
to,
18th century.
How-
Yes, yes. I don't see why they were so concerned about it, but still.
There we go. Lucky they did. They had some good architects around at the time, didn't
Oh,
they?
they did, yes. They certainly had a lot of talent.
Yeah.
Yes, they did. Yes.
Well, Frank, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Oh,
again.
you're very welcome, very welcome.